ladled a cup of chamomile tea, letting the steam warm her face. Daniel came in, placing a small kiss on her temple before sitting nearby. "You were strong," he said again. "I just told the truth," she answered. He nodded. "That's what strength is?" She didn't reply, but a single tear slid down her cheek, not from sadness, but from release. Some doors were meant to stay closed, some chapters didn't need revisiting, and some victories didn't come with cheers, only silence and peace. In the following months, Ivy threw herself into the expansion of the Grace Initiative. With each new home opened, each scholarship awarded, each rescued girl given back her voice, the echoes of her past grew softer. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't put her name in headlines. She simply worked, quietly, purposefully, like someone who had nothing left to prove but everything to give. One morning, as she stood before the mirror in her room, she wore a white gown once more. Not for a wedding, but for her church ceremony. A celebration of faith, of second chances, of beginnings. Her belly had begun to swell slightly, the first hint of the life she carried. She placed her hand gently over it, smiling. Daniel entered, already dressed in a clean, pale suit. He watched her with eyes full of reverence. "You look like a dream," he said softly. She turned, tears in her lashes. "Thank you for choosing me," she whispered, "when I was just a shadow in a broken house." "You were never a shadow," he said, walking toward her. "You were just covered in dust. Now the world sees your light." The ceremony was held in a chapel on the grounds of Harper House. Children from the foundation lined the aisle, tossing petals as Ivy walked past. Business leaders, artists, women who had once been girls in hiding, all stood for her. The vows were spoken again, not to claim, but to celebrate. To remind the world that love built on honor is the rarest kind. At the reception, Ivy stood on a small stage and held the microphone, her voice low but steady. "I want to thank all of you," she said, "not just for being here today, but for believing in a woman who once slept on a floor. This isn't about wealth. This isn't about titles. This is about hope." The hall fell silent. "I was once called unwanted, a maid, a mistake. But someone saw me, treated me with dignity, and that gave me the courage to become who I am today." She paused, looking over the room. Daniel stood at the back, clapping already, tears in his eyes. "Sometimes, the ones the world throws away are the ones sent to rebuild it. My name is Ivy Harper, and I carry it now with pride." Applause erupted, not of obligation, but of awe. That night, as they drove home through the quiet streets, Ivy leaned her head against the window and whispered, "God, I don't know why you chose to lift me, but I will never forget where I came from." Daniel took her hand. "You don't need to forget. That's where your strength was born." And in that silence, Ivy knew she wasn't just a wife or a leader. She was a symbol, a testimony, a name they had tried to erase, now carved into stone and memory. She was Ivy, and the world would never forget it again. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other powerful stories and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Your support means everything. She didn't tell her husband that she had inherited a mansion and $10 million. When the truth came out, it was too late. Subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching from. I never imagined that silence could one day protect me more than any signature, any legal document, or any grand gesture of defiance. But then again, I never imagined I would inherit a fortune either, much less keep it a secret from the man I would marry. On the morning I received the call from my late aunt's attorney, I was sipping stale coffee in the break room of the marketing agency where I worked, thinking only about how to stretch my paycheck another week. I wasn't special, not in the way movies make people special. I worked hard, minded my business, and stayed grounded. But my Aunt Loretta always said I was different. "You don't just walk through the world, Jazz," she would tell me with that smirk she wore like red lipstick. "You read it. You feel it. That's why you're going to do better than any of us ever did." Loretta had been the rebel of the family, while my parents, both hard-working and deeply proud people, stayed in our modest neighborhood in South Chicago. Mom, a nurse, Dad, a carpenter. Loretta had traveled, hustled, bought property before people realized it was worth something. When she opened her third consignment boutique and started talking about vintage watches and auction houses, the family labeled her eccentric. Some even whispered that she was reckless with money. But I saw something else. I saw a woman who built an empire with her own 2 hands. Her death came suddenly. A stroke in her sleep. I cried for 2 days. Not because she left me anything. At the time, I didn't even know she had. I cried because she was the only person in my life who ever truly made me believe that I could be more than what the world expected of me. So, when her lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Horace Burton, called to request my presence, I assumed it was just for a final reading of the will, some closure. I thought maybe I'd get one of her rings, or maybe that peacock brooch she always wore to church. I arrived at the office on a windy Wednesday morning. Mr. Burton greeted me with a thin smile and eyes that looked like they'd seen too many secrets. He wore a navy suit and a tie with barely visible gold stitching, and everything about him said this wasn't going to be a quick meeting. "Miss Delaney," he said as he gestured for me to sit. "Your aunt thought very highly of you." "She was the best person I've ever known," I replied, my voice already thickening. "She didn't have to leave me anything." "She didn't leave you a part of her estate," he said. "She left you all of it." I blinked. "Excuse me." "All of it," he repeated. 3 residential properties, 1 in Hyde Park, 1 in Bronzeville, and a 3rd in Old Town. A collection of appraised antiques, primarily mid-century and early 20th century. Stocks in 4 companies, a high-yield savings account with 7 figures, and a sizable private collection of artwork. I sat still. The air seemed to change, the light from the window dulling. I don't understand. Why me?" He smiled just a little. "She believed you would know how to protect it." He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a handwritten letter. It smelled faintly of jasmine and ink. Loretta's script, sharp, intentional, lined the page. "Jazz, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if you're wondering why I left it all to you, it's because I trust your judgment. You're not the type to be dazzled by money. You know the difference between value and vanity. I've seen how this family acts around wealth. I've seen what people do when they think they're owed something. Protect this, Jazz. It's yours. But only reveal it when you feel safe, not a moment sooner. Love always, L." I reread the letter 3 times before I looked up. Why would she want me to keep it secret? Mr. Burton laced his fingers together. Because people are unpredictable, especially when money is involved. He then explained the trust, the legal protections, the stipulation that nothing should be declared marital property unless I chose to make it so. He went over bank accounts, tenants in the rental properties, contact information for her art appraiser. He even offered to connect me with a financial advisor. By the time I left the office, I was a different person. Not on the outside. I still wore my thrifted trench coat and scuffed boots, but inside, something had shifted. I felt taller, sharper, as if I'd stepped into a world I never knew I was part of, a world I'd only ever watched from behind a pane of glass. I didn't tell anyone, not my coworkers, not my best friend, not even my parents. Part of me didn't believe it myself, and part of me, larger, louder, was afraid. Afraid of what people might do if they knew, afraid of who they'd become. I thought of the cousins who rolled their eyes at Loretta, the aunts who scoffed at her handbags. What would they say now? For the next several months, I lived the same. Same job, same neighborhood. I'd drive by the properties she'd left me sometimes, watching from afar as tenants came and went. The old town property especially, an elegant limestone building with ivy creeping up its side, tugged at something in me. That one I kept empty for now. It felt too personal to rent out. It still smelled like her. When my bank account began to grow with rental income, I started tucking money away. I upgraded my health insurance, paid off my parents' credit card debts anonymously. I did small things, things that couldn't be traced. And then came the night I met Andrew. It was at a fundraiser for a nonprofit where one of my coworkers volunteered. I wasn't planning to go, but she'd begged me to attend as moral support. I showed up in a black sheath dress and low heels, hair pulled back into a twist. The room was full of the type of people who wore confidence like cologne, white teeth, expensive laughs. I made for the hors d'oeuvres. Andrew was standing by the bar with two men in gray suits, and when I reached for a glass of wine, he reached at the same time. "Go ahead," he said with a smile that made his cheekbones pop. "I insist." He was tall, lean, but not thin, with a kind of restless energy that drew people in. His voice was smooth, practiced, but not arrogant. We chatted about the art on the walls, the music. He asked about my work, and for once I didn't undersell it. I told him about my marketing campaigns, my research, the beauty in understanding what people want. He told me he worked in media strategy, consulting for political campaigns, managing narratives. It sounded complicated and a little cynical, but he made it seem exciting. By the end of the evening, he'd gotten my number. By the end of the week, he'd taken me out for tapas. 2 months later, we were inseparable. Andrew was everything I'd thought I wanted. Educated, driven, attentive. He sent flowers for no reason. He listened when I spoke. He remembered my favorite tea. I tried not to think about the differences between us, about how his world had always been paved for him, about how his family lived in a different tax bracket. And then he took me to meet his mother. Her name was Suzanne, but everyone called her Sloane. The name suited her, crisp, untouchable. Her home was like a spread from a lifestyle magazine, creams and golds, orchids and glass. She hugged me with a chill. "You're lovely," she said, but her eyes moved over me like I was being scanned. The questions began immediately. "Where did you study? Do your parents still work? And your background? Is it primarily business or creative?" I smiled, answered politely, let the unease roll off my back. But that night, lying in Andrew's apartment, I stared at the ceiling and thought, she'll never accept me. Not really. When Andrew proposed 6 months later, it was in a private garden, petals on the ground, a vintage ring on a silk ribbon. It should have been perfect, and yet all I could think of was Loretta's voice. "Protect this. It's yours." I said yes. I kissed him. I told myself love was enough, but I didn't tell him about the inheritance. I didn't tell him about the properties or the stocks or the art sitting in a storage unit downtown. I didn't mention the account that earned more in interest each month than I made at my job. I kept it all to myself. And I didn't know then, but that decision, my silence, would become the one thing that saved me. The days following our engagement passed in a sort of euphoric daze. Andrew was radiant with pride, showing off the ring on my finger like it was a trophy he had won. Friends congratulated us. My co-workers passed around a card with cheesy little hearts drawn in the margins. Even my mother cried when I told her, whispering over the phone that she hoped I'd finally found someone who would cherish me for all that I was. But even through all the celebrations, a part of me remained still. Quiet. Watching. I knew what was coming. I could feel it in the way Andrew's voice shifted when he talked about introducing me to his family's circle. The subtle tension in his shoulders when I asked about his mother's reaction to the engagement. He brushed it off with a smile, said she was a little surprised but happy. Surprised. That word stayed with me. A week later, I found myself standing on the stone porch of Suzanne Whitmore's home in Winnetka, the kind of place that belonged in estate catalogs or European films. Ivy covered one side of the house, not the wild, messy kind, but the kind that had been trimmed to perfection. Everything about the place screamed order, structure, legacy. The door opened before Andrew could press the bell, as if she'd been watching from the window. "Mother," he said, leaning in to kiss her cheek, "you remember Jasmine." Suzanne didn't smile, but her lips twitched upward like she'd practiced it in front of a mirror. "Of course. Welcome, dear." She led us inside. The interior was warm-toned, polished, and silent. Thick rugs muffled our footsteps. Family portraits lined the hallway, generations of fair-haired, sharp-jawed men and women gazing down like marble statues. I glanced up at them as we passed. No one in those frames looked like me. Dinner was set in the formal dining room. Crystal glasses, linen napkins, silver so polished I saw my face in the knife. Suzanne sat at the head of the table, Andrew at her right. I was placed at her left, as if that somehow made me the balance in her carefully curated world. Conversation started simply enough. Weather, Andrew's work, a mention of a cousin's wedding in Connecticut. But then came the probing. "So, Jasmine," Suzanne said, swirling her wine with 2 fingers delicately raised, "tell me again where you grew up." I smiled. "South Chicago. My parents still live there." She took a sip. "And your mother's a nurse, I believe?" "Yes, and my father's a retired carpenter." "How noble," she said, as though I'd told her they worked in a monastery. I felt Andrew's knee nudge mine under the table, a silent plea to let it go. She continued, "And your degree? Marketing, wasn't it?" "Economics and marketing, yes. I work for a consultant agency now." She nodded. A respectable field, though Andrew's father always believed finance was the backbone of any real business. I didn't respond. I knew this wasn't about small talk. This was a subtle measurement of my worth, my pedigree, the invisible scale she used to weigh every person who entered her orbit. When dessert came, a delicate lemon tart with sugared violets, I excused myself to the powder room just to breathe. The bathroom was as pristine as the rest of the house, and for a moment I looked at myself in the mirror and wondered if I was making a mistake. But then I remembered Andrew's eyes when he proposed, the way he whispered my name like it mattered more than the moonlight above us. That had to mean something, didn't it? The next day, Suzanne called Andrew. I didn't hear the conversation, but when he hung up, his jaw was tight. "She thinks we're rushing," he said, "wants to be sure we're thinking clearly." I asked what that meant. She suggested we consider a prenuptial agreement, just as a precaution. I stared at him. "She suggested, or you agree?" He looked torn. "She's just looking out for me. That's all." That night, I lay awake while he slept beside me. I thought about Loretta's letter, about the properties sitting quietly in my name, about how easily my silence had shielded them from suspicion. I realized then that Suzanne wasn't just wary. She didn't believe I belonged. She saw me as a temporary guest in their world, one that needed to be contained. But I wasn't going anywhere. We moved forward with the wedding plans, though every decision became a point of friction. Suzanne insisted we use her family's florist, her country club's ballroom, the same caterer who'd served her own wedding 40 years ago. When I suggested a different color scheme, she smiled thinly and said, "Of course, darling. It's your day after all." But she never backed down. Andrew, to his credit, tried to balance the scale. He defended me, softened her sharper edges, told me we could do whatever I wanted. But he never directly challenged her. That disappointed me more than I let on. On the day of our wedding, I wore ivory silk and a veil edged in lace. My mother helped me button the back, her fingers trembling. She kissed my cheek and whispered that she was proud of me, that I looked like someone who knew exactly where she was going. The ceremony was beautiful. Vows exchanged under a canopy of trees, soft string music playing as golden light filtered through the leaves. People cried, people laughed. Suzanne wore a pale blue suit and kept her emotions in check, dabbing at her eyes with a linen handkerchief but never letting her mascara run. At the reception, she toasted us with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "To Andrew and Jasmine," she said, raising her glass, "may your love be wise, enduring, and prudent." The word hung in the air like a stone. Prudent. Later that evening, as the guests danced and the champagne flowed, I stood by the window of the venue, watching the sky turn from dusk to night. Andrew found me there, slipped his arm around my waist. "We did it," he said, resting his chin on my shoulder. I leaned into him. Yes, we did. But inside, something had already shifted. We spent our first night as husband and wife in a suite his family reserved at a luxury hotel downtown. Everything was gold and white and soft. The sheets were like clouds. The breakfast came on a tray the next morning with a tiny vase of orchids. We laughed, we kissed, but I still didn't tell him. I didn't tell him that I could have paid for 10 weddings without blinking, that I had a painting in storage that a collector recently offered 6 figures for, that I was making more in passive income every month than he'd ever known. I didn't tell him because I wasn't sure yet if he would have loved me had he known. I didn't tell him because Suzanne's toast still echoed in my mind. I didn't tell him because I wanted to be loved for the girl he met at a fundraiser, not the woman with more wealth than his entire family tree. The morning we returned to the apartment, technically owned by his father, though we called it ours, I unlocked the door with my key and stepped inside. It smelled faintly of lemons and lavender. Suzanne had sent a cleaner while we were gone. There was a note on the kitchen counter. "Welcome home. Let me know if you'd like me to help arrange the closets. Warmly, Mother." I folded the note and placed it in a drawer. Andrew laughed when I showed it to him, but I didn't. I knew better. This wasn't a welcome. It was a warning. The first few weeks of married life were filled with polite rituals and carefully curated peace. On the surface, everything looked as it should. 2 professionals in love settling into the rhythm of domestic partnership. Our apartment had been redecorated while we were on our honeymoon. Suzanne had sent a team in with new curtains, fresh flowers, and an updated color scheme, pale blues and creams, the exact palette from her own home. She called it a gift, but I saw it for what it was, an assertion. A quiet declaration that I now belonged to a system, not a family. Andrew didn't question it. "She means well," he said, sipping his coffee as if everything were normal. I nodded, pretending to agree. But something inside me bristled every time I touched the new linen or smelled the lavender sachets stuffed in our drawers, knowing I hadn't chosen a single thing. It wasn't long before the visit started, unannounced, always. Suzanne would appear mid-morning or late afternoon, dressed impeccably, holding a tray of pastries or a new book she thought I should read. She'd greet Andrew with a kiss on the cheek and sweep into the kitchen like she lived there. I watched her rearrange the spice rack, criticize the lighting, frown at the way I folded the dish towels. Once, I came home early from work and found her going through our kitchen drawers. "Just trying to organize things a bit better," she said, not even looking up. I stood there in silence, clutching my bag, and realized that this was never going to be my home, not as long as she held the key. Andrew was always apologetic but passive. He promised to talk to her, but nothing ever changed. I didn't press it. I didn't want to be the wife who nagged or complained. I was trying to be gracious, to be accepted. But with every intrusion, I felt more like an outsider in my own life. It wasn't just Suzanne. Something in Andrew began to shift, subtly at first. He was more distracted, less affectionate. He worked longer hours. He took calls in the other room. He started leaving the apartment early, before I was even awake, and coming home late. When I asked about it, he said it was a busy quarter, but his eyes didn't match his words. Our conversations became transactional. "What's for dinner? Did you call the plumber? Did you pay the electricity bill?" The intimacy drained from our lives like water from a cracked cup. And yet, to the world outside, we remained the picture of a modern marriage. We went to dinners, smiled for photos, laughed at jokes neither of us found funny anymore. Then came the money talk. It started innocently enough. Suzanne had invited us over for brunch. Blueberry scones, fresh squeezed juice, poached eggs on toast points. She sat at the head of the table, Andrew and I across from each other. Between bites, she launched into a conversation about financial planning. "I've been thinking," she said, slicing her scone with surgical precision, "that now you two are married, it would be wise to have a consolidated financial strategy, shared goals, combined assets." Andrew nodded slowly. "We've talked about maybe getting a joint account." "Oh, that's a start," she said, her smile tight. "But I mean a proper review. Jasmine, dear, you must have some savings. Retirement, investments. You're a smart girl. Surely you've thought of the future." I met her gaze. "I have." "Well, perhaps we could meet with my advisor, just to ensure everything's aligned. In marriages, transparency is everything." I pushed my plate away. I prefer to manage my finances independently. She blinked, then chuckled softly. "Of course. But independence can coexist with trust. Don't you agree, Andrew?" He hesitated, just a flicker, but I saw it. "Sure," he said carefully, "but if Jasmine's not comfortable." Suzanne waved a hand. "It's just a suggestion." But it wasn't. It was a test, and I'd failed it. From that moment, the temperature of our home changed. Suzanne stopped pretending to be cordial. Her visits became critiques. She commented on my wardrobe, the way I styled my hair, the groceries I bought. Once, she looked at a simple bouquet I'd placed on the kitchen table and said, "Sunflowers are so casual." Andrew, instead of defending me, began to echo her tone. He joked about how I wasn't very domestic. He laughed when she said I had eccentric tastes. I felt myself shrinking with every passing week, folding in on myself like parchment near a flame. Then came the contract. It was a Tuesday evening. I was folding laundry in the bedroom when Andrew came in, holding a manila envelope. He looked nervous. "What's that?" I asked, not looking up. He sat beside me. "It's just something my mother wanted us to consider." I paused, then opened the envelope. Inside was a formal document, a postnuptial agreement. It outlined in clinical detail provisions for the separation of assets. It didn't mention my inheritance directly, but it was clear what it was designed to protect, his family's interests, not mine. "I'm not signing this," I said, handing it back. Andrew ran a hand through his hair. "It's just precautionary." "No," I said firmly. "It's a message that your mother doesn't trust me, that maybe you don't either." He didn't deny it. We didn't speak for the rest of the night. That weekend, I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend. I needed space, time, clarity. I sat in her guest room and stared at the ceiling, wondering how it had come to this. How love had turned to suspicion. How a man who once memorized the way I took my tea was now handing me legal paperwork drafted by his mother's attorney. I thought of Loretta again, her laugh, her eyes, the way she always knew who people really were. I understood her now, her insistence on secrecy, her warning that money could turn people into strangers. I returned home 3 days later. The apartment was spotless. Suzanne had been there, no doubt. A new vase of roses stood on the table. Red, bold, a declaration. Andrew greeted me with a hesitant smile. "Did you think?" he asked. "I did. And? I won't sign anything. I haven't done anything to warrant distrust." His jaw tightened. "You're being unreasonable." "Am I? Or is it unreasonable to marry someone and expect them to give up everything they've ever built just to fit into a mold you and your mother created?" He didn't answer. After that, things deteriorated quickly. We stopped touching, stopped laughing. Even breathing the same air felt difficult. I went to work early, stayed late. I spent more time at the properties Loretta left me, overseeing renovations, checking on tenants, walking through the empty halls of the old townhouse, and letting the silence remind me of who I was before all of this. One afternoon, while checking mail forwarded to the old office of Loretta's estate, I noticed an envelope addressed to her, postmarked weeks after her death. Inside was a real estate newsletter, one of those glossy things that listed high-profile properties and owners. One of the pages had a picture of the old townhouse listed under notable private holdings. There was a small mention of the name on the title, Jasmine Delaney. I stared at it for a long time. Then I folded it, placed it in my bag, and walked outside into the cold air. Someone had been looking into me, and I had a sinking feeling I knew who. Later that week, Andrew came home late. He smelled like cologne I didn't recognize. He said he was working. I didn't ask questions. The next day, I received a call from a realtor, one I hadn't spoken to in years. She said someone had contacted her, inquiring about the value of the old town property. Someone named Suzanne Whitmore. My blood went cold. I realized then that they weren't just suspicious. They were digging, trying to confirm what they already suspected, that I had something they hadn't known about, something I hadn't offered. And, in their eyes, that was betrayal. But I hadn't betrayed anyone. I had simply protected myself, and soon I would have to do it again, on a much larger scale. It was a quiet Sunday morning when the illusion finally cracked. The city was still sleeping, the sky painted in soft hues of lavender and rose. I stood by the window, holding a mug of tea that had long gone cold, watching the street below as joggers passed, and an old man walked his dog, blissfully unaware that upstairs A marriage was unraveling thread by thread. The silence between Andrew and me had become a third presence in the apartment. An invisible guest who sat at our breakfast table, curled between us on the couch, climbed into bed at night and settled like a weight across my chest. There were no more tender glances, no idle conversations about our days, no more laughter. We spoke only when necessary, and even then, our words were chosen like weapons, sharp and cautious. Since the moment I refused to sign the postnuptial agreement, something had shifted in Andrew. He moved through the apartment as though it belonged to someone else. When I asked him simple questions, he responded with clipped sentences, never meeting my eyes. I found myself rehearsing every word before I spoke, anticipating his reactions, bracing for disappointment. I was not his wife. I was his opponent, standing trial for a crime I hadn't committed. But I knew why. I knew what Suzanne had discovered. I had underestimated her. For all her prim smiles and pearl earrings, she was calculating and persistent. Imagined her sitting in some private office, flipping through property records, cross-checking names, searching for the invisible thread she had always suspected was there. The woman didn't want a daughter-in-law. She wanted an acquisition, a manageable extension of her family brand. But I was never going to be that. The confirmation came in the form of a visit. It was late afternoon when the doorbell rang. I was expecting a package, so I opened the door without checking. Suzanne stood there, flanked by a man in a slate-gray suit, his face smooth and unreadable. He held a leather folder in one hand and a tablet in the other. "Jasmine," she said, her voice flat, "may we come in?" I hesitated. Every instinct told me to close the door, but I stepped aside. She walked in like she owned the place, eyes sweeping the room with the detached air of a curator inspecting a lesser exhibit. The man followed, nodding politely, then placing the folder on the kitchen island. "I won't waste your time," Suzanne said, turning to face me. "I know about the properties, the inheritance, the holdings in your name." I said nothing. She waited, then continued. "You've deceived my son, our family. You married him under false pretenses. Had we known—" "Had you known what?" I interrupted. "That I had the foresight to protect myself? That I didn't enter this marriage as a charity case?" The man in the suit cleared his throat. "Miss Delaney, I represent Mrs. Whitmore's financial interests. She's requested that we draft an amended agreement. One that acknowledges the assets you failed to disclose." "I'm not obligated to disclose anything that predates this marriage," I said, my voice calm. "Legally," he conceded, "that may be true, but ethically—" "I don't owe you ethics," I snapped, my patience evaporating. "You've treated me like an intruder from the beginning, and now that you know I'm not what you assumed, you want to control what's mine." Suzanne's lips thinned. "You will sign the document. If not, we will proceed with legal action. We'll expose everything." "Expose what?" I asked. "That your son married a woman who turned out to be smarter than you thought?" Her eyes blazed. The mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw the fury beneath. Not disappointment. Not betrayal. Fury. The fury of someone who had built her entire identity on power and now realized it wasn't hers to wield in this case. "You think you've won something," she said quietly, "but you haven't. You've just confirmed everything I feared about you." "No," I said, "you've confirmed everything I feared about you." I asked them to leave. The man gathered his folder and tablet. Suzanne didn't move for a long moment. Then she walked past me, her perfume sharp in the air, and paused at the door. "You'll regret this," she said. I didn't respond. When the door clicked shut, I sat down at the kitchen island and let the silence press in around me. My hands trembled. Not from fear, but from rage, from the bitter realization that Andrew had allowed this, that he had not only told her about his suspicions, but had condoned this ambush. There was no coming back from that. He returned later that evening, his tie loose, hair tousled, eyes unreadable. I was sitting in the living room, the envelope from Suzanne still on the table. "She came," I said. He nodded. "She told me." "You sent her?" "She had a right to know." "No, Andrew. She had a suspicion, and you gave her permission to act on it." He sat down across from me, resting his elbows on his knees. "You lied to me." "I didn't lie. I omitted." "Same thing." "No, it's not," I said. "A lie is when you tell someone something false. An omission is when you protect yourself from being treated like property." He flinched. "That's not what this is about." "Isn't it? Because ever since your mother found out, this stopped being a marriage and became a campaign. She's trying to win something, and you're letting her. She thinks, I don't care what she thinks." He stood up. "So what, Jasmine? You were just going to keep it all hidden forever? Let me believe we were building a life together while you kept one foot out the door?" "I wasn't keeping anything from you because I didn't trust you," I said. "I was keeping it from your mother, from this family. And now I see that was the right choice." There was a long silence. He looked at me, really looked, and I could see the moment he realized I was no longer the woman he proposed to. I was something else now, something independent, resolute, unreachable. I had pulled myself back from him, not out of spite, but out of necessity. "I want a divorce," I said. The words hung in the air like smoke. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. "I won't fight you," I continued. "I don't want anything from you, not your money, not your sympathy, just a clean break." He swallowed. "You're really going to walk away?" "I already have." The next week was a blur of logistics. I called my attorney, initiated proceedings, moved out of the apartment. I didn't take much, just my clothes, a few personal items, and my dignity. Suzanne's threats never materialized, likely because she realized there was nothing she could take from me that I hadn't already secured. I moved into the old townhouse. For the first time in months, I felt safe. It was quiet, but not the suffocating silence I'd known with Andrew. It was a peaceful kind of quiet, a space untouched by suspicion or manipulation. I hired a small team to begin restoring the house. I threw myself into the work, choosing fabrics, fixtures, paints. I met with financial planners, reviewed the portfolio Loretta had left, and took control of every detail. I became the woman she always told me I could be. Word of the divorce spread, of course. There were whispers in Andrew's circle, pitying glances from acquaintances who assumed I'd been cast out. But I didn't care. I didn't owe them an explanation. And one morning, as I stood in the sunlit hallway of my new home, sipping coffee and watching a painter lay down a fresh coat of white on the crown molding, I felt something shift inside me. Not sadness, not regret, but a quiet kind of triumph. I'd survived the war no one saw, and I'd done it without raising my voice, without begging, without compromise. The masks were off, and I was still standing. In the months that followed my decision to leave Andrew, I learned that grief does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it follows you from room to room, trailing the scent of what could have been. I did not cry the night I packed my things. I did not fall apart the morning I walked out of that apartment for the last time. There were no slamming doors, no public breakdowns. My departure was quiet, precise, almost surgical, like removing a splinter too deeply lodged to heal around. Andrew didn't fight the divorce. At first, I thought it was dignity. Later, I realized it was cowardice. He never called, never asked me to stay. He let the attorneys speak for him. His name came up only in legal correspondence and forwarded mail. We became strangers who once promised forever. The legal proceedings moved faster than I expected. Our prenup, ironically crafted at his mother's insistence, left little to contest. I made no claims, requested no alimony. The assets were divided cleanly, efficiently. I waived everything. His apartment, his family's connections, even a portion of joint savings we had barely touched. I didn't want any of it. I had what I needed: my name, my inheritance, and a freedom I now realized I'd been gasping for since the day I said I do. The final hearing was brief. The judge, a middle-aged woman with soft features and eyes that held no judgment, glanced between us with a practiced professionalism. Andrew sat to my left, suited and silent. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically. His posture was still confident, his suit pressed, but something about him had diminished. The light behind his eyes, perhaps. Or maybe it was me who had changed. Maybe I no longer looked at him with the softness I once carried. When the judge read the final decree, something inside me exhaled, a quiet, tremulous release. Not relief, not victory, just air. I stood. He stood. Our eyes met for a flicker of a second, and then we turned in opposite directions. I walked into the late morning light, the Chicago wind biting at my coat, and I did not look back. Life alone was not lonely. It was spacious. I filled it with things I had postponed: long walks through the park without checking my phone, hours curled on the couch reading the books Loretta left behind, evenings spent in the quiet of my old town home, where every brick and beam seemed to whisper that I had made it. Not just through the divorce, through the war of expectations, the suffocation of performance, the weight of being someone else's idea of worthy. I found joy in solitude. I found it in the smell of paint drying on new walls, in the warm glow of Edison bulbs strung across the back garden, in the way sunlight hit the hardwood floors just right in the late afternoon. I hosted dinners, not for society, not for photographs, but for friends who made me laugh until I cried. I invited my parents, who sat at the long oak table and held my hands like they were memorizing me all over again. I told them only the parts they needed to know: that I was safe, that I was better, that I was building something new. But the past has a way of knocking when it's least welcome. It was late spring when I saw them again. I'd just left a meeting with my estate manager and was walking through the lobby of a boutique hotel when I caught a glimpse of Suzanne in the lounge. She sat with two women, both dressed in pastels and expensive shoes, laughing over a pot of tea. Her posture was perfect, her hair tucked in its signature chignon. I almost passed without pause. Almost. But something in me stopped. A reflex, perhaps. I turned my head just enough for her to see me. Her laughter stilled. Her smile faded. For a second, we stared at each other. Not as family, not even as acquaintances. As two women who had tried to outlast the other in silence. I gave her a single nod. Not bitter, not proud, just final. She did not return it. I walked out of the hotel into the bright afternoon sun, my heart steady. That was the last time I saw her. She no longer had power over me. And Andrew, well, he faded like smoke. I heard things from mutual friends. He was traveling. He was dating someone younger. He was reconsidering his career. None of it mattered. Not anymore. Because I was beginning to see what Loretta had given me beyond wealth. She had given me time, space, the ability to live without dependence, to love without obligation. and she had given me the wisdom to know when to walk away, even when staying seemed easier. With that wisdom, I created something I could have never built in the Whitmore household. I founded a nonprofit initiative in Loretta's name, designed to mentor young women from underrepresented backgrounds in financial literacy and property ownership. I knew what it meant to be handed something valuable without the tools to manage it. I wanted others to have what I had been lucky enough to receive: guidance, patience, protection. The launch was modest: a few partners, a few grants, a team of passionate volunteers. But it was mine, every inch of it. From the mission statement to the logo to the resource materials, I touched every part of its creation. And when we hosted our first workshop, I stood before a room of girls, some shy, some eager, all wide-eyed, and I spoke without a trace of fear. I told them not about my divorce, not about Suzanne, but about strength, the quiet kind. The kind that sits in your chest when you're surrounded by people who doubt you, and still you don't shrink. I told them about dignity, about holding your tongue when the world tries to define you by your bank account, your skin, your silence. I told them to make decisions that made them proud of their reflection. After the session, one of the girls came up to me. She couldn't have been older than 16. "Did you always know you'd end up okay?" she asked. I thought about it. "No," I said, "but I always knew I'd try." And that was the truth. Through every judgment, every dismissal, every door I was asked to enter through the back, I had tried to keep my head high, to keep my hands clean, to keep my soul intact. And now, at last, I could breathe. Not just because the marriage was over, but because I had learned to stop asking permission to exist fully. I had learned that freedom doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives with quiet certainty, with the sound of your own voice in your own home saying, "I am still here." There would be other chapters, other loves, perhaps, other conflicts, but this one, this return to self, was the foundation upon which I would build the rest. No chains, no noise, just me. Summer arrived with unapologetic brilliance. The days stretched long, drenched in sunlight, and the nights were warm enough to leave the windows open without regret. By then, the nonprofit I had founded in Loretta's name, the Delaney Initiative, had gained steady ground. What began as a quiet idea in my living room had bloomed into a recognizable name in the community. We had more applicants than we could handle. Local press began taking interest, and 2 of our girls were already on track to purchase their first investment properties by the end of the year. But with visibility came scrutiny, and with attention came curiosity. I knew it was only a matter of time before someone in Andrew's circle came across the name Delaney again. Not attached to a passive wife, but to a woman building something entirely her own. I hadn't spoken his name in nearly a year, and yet a part of me still braced for the moment the past would try to knock. It came quietly, not with a phone call or letter, but through a photograph in the business section of the Tribune. The article featured local philanthropists making waves in real estate education for underserved communities. There I was, standing in the middle of our rented community center, smiling modestly, surrounded by a group of bright-eyed young women. My name was in bold. Jasmine Delaney, founder and CEO of the Delaney Initiative. The accompanying write-up referenced my inheritance only briefly, noting that it had been a private transfer through a late family member, but the numbers were there. The value of our assets, the properties, the grants, the scope. I knew someone would show that article to Suzanne. I didn't care. But the storm that followed exceeded even my lowest expectations. 3 days after the article ran, I received a bouquet of white lilies at my office, flowers I despised, which Suzanne had once declared elegant and subdued. The card attached was unsigned, just a simple sentence in neat cursive, "I see now." 2 hours later, a voicemail arrived from a number I didn't recognize. It was Andrew. "Jasmine, I don't know what to say. I read the article. I didn't know. I wish we could talk. I owe you an apology, or more than one, please. Just call me back." I didn't. The next day, he showed up at the center. I was speaking with one of our volunteers when I noticed him standing at the door, wearing a gray sport coat and an expression that looked like shame, dressed in expensive cologne. I excused myself, walked over, and met his eyes with a calm I hadn't known I possessed. "Andrew," I said. "Jasmine," he said. "You look, well." "I am." There was an awkward pause. He looked around the room, at the bulletin board filled with announcements and achievements, at the mural painted by our students, at the girls laughing in the back near the kitchenette. His eyes softened, but the lines of regret etched deeper around his mouth. "This is yours?" he asked quietly. "All of it." "I didn't know. About Loretta. About any of it." "I didn't tell you." "Why?" I took a breath. "Because I wanted to know if you'd love me without it. I wanted to know if I mattered, not what I had." He looked down. "And I failed." "Yes," I said, not unkindly. "You did." "I was scared," he said, "of losing control, of disappointing my mother, of not being enough. I let her get in my head." I didn't answer. That wasn't new information. "I see what you've built now," he continued, "and I can't believe I tried to make you small." There was a long silence. "I came to say I'm sorry," he said finally, "for all of it." "I believe you," I said, "but that doesn't change anything." He nodded. "I know." He left quietly. He didn't ask for another chance. He didn't beg. I appreciated that, but his presence lingered long after he was gone. Not because I missed him, but because I had spent so long trying to be seen by people who only learned to look when it was too late. In the weeks that followed, other calls came. A distant cousin of Suzanne's requesting a friendly coffee, a former family friend who once ignored me at dinner, now asking if I'd be open to mentoring her niece. Even Suzanne herself sent a letter, handwritten. It was 3 pages long, composed in the tone of someone who had been humbled but not transformed. She wrote that she understood now why I'd kept my inheritance a secret. She admitted that she had judged me by the surface of my skin, my upbringing, my voice. She said she had mistaken quiet strength for absence of substance, and that had been her greatest error. She ended the letter by saying she hoped I'd consider joining a board she was part of, a women's philanthropy council, and that she believed we could do more good together than apart. I read the letter once, then again. And then I placed it in the drawer with the white lilies card. I didn't reply, because forgiveness did not mean alliance. Understanding did not guarantee reconciliation, and some doors, once closed, must remain so, not out of bitterness, but out of wisdom. I continued to build. That summer, we launched our second satellite office on the south side, closer to where I'd grown up. My parents came to the ribbon cutting, standing proud in the front row, my mother dabbing her eyes while my father tried to act like he wasn't beaming. I gave a short speech. I kept it simple. I spoke of vision, of community, of what it meant to plant seeds in soil others had declared barren. That night, I walked the quiet streets of my old neighborhood. They hadn't changed much. Some new buildings, some old scars, but the soul of the place was intact. A few girls from the new program recognized me. They waved from across the street. I waved back. I remembered what it had been like to walk those same sidewalks as a teenager, dreaming of something bigger but unsure if it was allowed. And now, here I was, not just living that dream, but carving space for others to walk beside me. I returned home to the old town house just before midnight. The air was warm and still. I made a cup of tea, sat by the open window, and let the sounds of the city settle around me. I thought about Andrew again, just briefly. About what it must feel like to realize too late that the person you dismissed was the very person who could have elevated your entire world. I didn't take pleasure in it, but I didn't grieve it either. Some truths take time to bloom. His had come too late, but mine had arrived right on time. I no longer needed approval, no longer sought acknowledgement from those who only recognized value once it appeared in headlines. I had learned to live without applause, to thrive without permission. And that, more than anything, was the inheritance Loretta had truly left me. The fortune was real, yes, the properties, the investments, the security, but the true wealth was invisible, stitched into my backbone, rooted in my choices, spoken through the lives I'd touched. And now the world knew. But it didn't matter anymore, because I'd already known all along. The wind off Lake Michigan had a bite that September, the kind of cold that slipped past coats and tucked into bones. But I didn't mind. The season was changing, and with it, so was everything I understood about my life. From the outside, it may have seemed that I had simply stepped into a more comfortable role, wealthy, independent, a respected figure in a corner of the world where women like me weren't always welcomed. But the transformation ran deeper than that. I had become someone no longer defined by what I had to prove, but instead by what I chose to protect. In the weeks since Andrew reappeared and then faded back into whatever orbit his life now occupied, I had received other inquiries. Journalists, podcasters, people wanting to tell my story. They asked for quotes, for interviews, for a peek behind the curtain of the woman who beat the odds. They wanted a tale of redemption, of vindication, of poetic justice wrapped in an elegant bow. But I declined every one, because this wasn't about them. It wasn't about public validation or headlines or the satisfaction of being right. It was about the quiet restoration of identity, of choosing myself when the world offered only versions of me it found more palatable. It was about having the power to say no to titles, to invitations, to narratives that didn't fit. That power had a name. My name. And for the first time in years, I spoke it without hesitation. Jasmine Delaney. Not Mrs. Whitmore, not Andrew's wife, not the quiet girl who knew her place. I was not someone's project or someone's obligation. I was not charity. I was not compromise. I was mine. The house in Old Town had become more than a home. It was a living thing now, warm with laughter, humming with purpose. My office overlooked the back garden, which we turned into a small reading nook with benches and trellises that bloomed in the spring. The walls were lined with photographs, not of me, but of the girls from our program, their first meetings, their first property viewings, their first keys. I had framed every one. On my desk was a single portrait of Loretta. Her eyes, still as fierce as I remembered, watched over the room like a promise. I often found myself speaking to her in the quiet moments, not out loud, but inwardly, telling her what had happened, what had become of the legacy she entrusted to me. I had honored it, not by hiding, not by surviving quietly, but by expanding it, by making sure her name, our name, stood for something. That month, we finalized plans for the third branch of the Delaney Initiative. This one would be in Detroit, where housing inequality had robbed generations of the chance to build equity. I hired a local team, young and passionate, and I promised them autonomy. We didn't replicate success, we seeded it, planted it where it was needed most, and let it grow in its own shape. At the opening ceremony, a young woman named Mariah came up to me, barely 21, full of fire and apprehension. She had just closed on her first duplex, and she held the deed in her hands like a fragile miracle. "I didn't think people like me could do this," she said, tears in her eyes. I smiled. "That's what they want you to believe. But the truth is, the world changes when you decide you're not asking anymore." She nodded slowly, gripping the folder tighter. "Make them say your name," I added. "Not because you asked them to, but because they have no choice." That night, back in Chicago, I walked through the halls of my home and lingered near the front door. The old wood still bore the tiny scuffs from when I moved in with nothing but a suitcase and a stubborn resolve. I traced my fingers over the frame, then turned and looked back into the warm light of the house. I saw all the versions of myself that had passed through this space. The woman who had whispered her doubts in the dark. The wife who'd stared into her husband's eyes and seen absence. The daughter-in-law who had endured silence at family dinners while her soul begged to be heard. And now, this woman who stood alone, not empty but full, of history, of purpose, of a name she now wore with pride. In the months that followed, there were more letters. Suzanne sent a second one, longer than the first, full of softened language and strained humility. She spoke of regret, of missed chances, of how, in trying to protect her son, she had wounded someone who never intended harm. I didn't reply, not because I hadn't forgiven her. I had, quietly, not for her sake, but for mine. But forgiveness did not mean access. It did not mean a seat at the table she once tried to pull out from under me. Andrew, to his credit, never reached out again. I imagined he understood that some things, once broken, aren't meant to be rebuilt. They're meant to be buried, so something stronger can grow in their place. By late October, I stood in front of a packed auditorium at a women's leadership summit. It was the first public appearance I'd agreed to, partly because it wasn't about me. It was about what we were building, what we were reclaiming. I spoke for 20 minutes. I didn't mention my divorce, or Suzanne, or even the inheritance. I spoke about what it meant to rebuild when no one thinks you belong in the first place, about how dignity is not handed to you, it is owned, moment by moment, choice by choice. I ended with a story about my grandmother, about how she used to write her name in the covers of every book she owned, even the tattered ones. Not because she feared losing them, but because she believed anything she touched should carry her mark, should bear witness to her presence in the world. That's what this was about. My name on deeds, on businesses, on programs. Not out of ego, but out of defiance, out of love. After the speech, a woman in the front row, middle-aged, soft-spoken, approached me. "Your story," she said, "it reminds me of my own. But I never left. I stayed. I gave it all away." I placed a hand on hers. "You're still here," I said, "so it's not too late to take some of it back." She nodded, her eyes full. And in that moment, I understood something that had eluded me even through all the battles and victories. This wasn't just about me. It was about legacy, not the kind measured in dollars or properties, but in echoes. In the voices of women who would stand taller because I had stood first. in the names they would one day say proudly, in the homes they would own, in the daughters they would raise without apology. It was about the mark we leave behind, and whether it's one the world tried to erase or one we carved into it deeply, deliberately, in our own hand. My name, my legacy, and no one would ever take it from me again. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos